a second. Okay. Okay, we are live. Yes. Hello, everybody, and welcome to once again another new episode for the Minority Report. I'm your host and as well as producer Alejandro Sirves Schizo, and with me, as always, is Doc Memphis. How you doing, Doc?
What's up, man?
And here we have our new guest. He is a member of New Resistance from Europe, and as well the editor in chief for the Center and deputy director from the Centre For Syncretic Studies. Here is with us Joaquin Flores. How are you doing, Joaquin?
Hey, good evening. I'm glad to be with you.
Yeah. So basically, before we go live, we had a very extensive conversation regarding foreign policy, different issues regarding the United States, and as well as Europe. So basically, now we would like to continue the conversation that we already had pre-established about if following the answer to the next question, has anything in Europe happened that changed the zeitgeist of European societies?
Yeah. So I think that when I look at what really happened is there was a very successful, and I think increasingly we're going to see it be successful, Gramscian counter-hegemonic or hegemonic campaign at the cultural level to employ advanced memetics, exploit certain tropes, and really expose how the this stage of capitalism and its period of neoliberal decline has really not provided even the semblance of an ideology. They got caught up in their own belief that we were in a post ideological period, and they failed to realize that this itself was an ideology. And so the big shift that we've seen now is a return to the significance of ideology, but more so, we've seen a successful turning of what's considered normal. And I think that once it's considered normal to question and to raise the level of the debate to where now it's normal to talk about fiat currencies. It's normal to talk about usury. It's normal to talk about questions of national sovereignty or immigration or the borders of Europe, for example. In Europe, it's normal now. So now there, of course, there's always going to be extremist groups. Maybe it's part of human nature, but also maybe a symptom of these times. But I think that what's become normalized and normal is very promising. I think there's a lot more work to do, but I would say that the breaking moment, the breaking point, was when Syriza in Greece simply failed to deliver a traditionally left of center left type of social movement that was based correctly in Euroscepticism, but once in power, essentially accepted every single diktat from Brussels and the Troika. So I think that was the real shifting moment that led to the opportunities that then arose and really necessitated all the changes that came after.
So so we are heading towards what we are seeing right now. We are heading towards a direction which is like you could call it in a sense a tyranny because it's really unpopular because all these measures taken by Brussels is not consulted by the people, so it's like it's an empire of sorts as well because nobody asked them for that but so called they have the back in the day the monarchs had the supposedly divine right of ruling, and now they have, I believe the human the guys the bureaucrats at Brussels has the human rights to govern the different peoples. Like for example, people from Greece that literally no one of them elected, but supposedly they know better than all of them. So we are heading towards a very complicated situation because these two forces, which is the bureaucrats and the people, are going to clash in any sense, and we are seeing that right now within France and Netherlands, I think, and Belgium to a later extent, you know. So I want to ask you the regarding this situation, how do you see how do you see these new popular and grassroots movements taking maybe a more take a more maybe a more revolutionary stand, just as the yellow vest that we are seeing today. How do you see this came into fruition?
So I think that the trajectory that we're on is a positive one, because I think we've already sort of passed the point of no return, where the ideological discourse has already shifted. I think that Internet 2.0, despite all of the clampdowns on social media, which have been severe, have been tremendous, have been oppressive, but I think is even too late. And I think evidence of that is the yellow vests. The yellow vest movement, as you know, came after the extreme new regime of censorship that really kicked into high gear between 2014 and 2016, where Google, AdSense, Twitter, Facebook, all of the giants combine and agree to deplatform and to silence and to eliminate and erase critical voices. Consider that for a moment. Consider how the yellow vest nevertheless delivered a popular message and organized tens and tens and tens of thousands of people into the streets, not just once, but week after week after week after week. This is a critical turning point. I think the yellow vest also shows that the traditional concepts that we used to have of left and right, conservative and liberal, or even communist and fascist, and all of these abstractions, that now we're in the 21st century. This is the time of we the living, now. This is not the 20th century, and there are many people with new ideas, and we've been able to look at the 20th century, and we've been able to look and see these were the mistakes, and these were the problems, these were the strengths, this is what worked. What can we take from what works and adapt it to the coming new technologies? 3D printing, the Internet of Things, uh, let's say blockchain democracy or direct democracy. There's different ways to do this. I mean, the old whole concept of the EU, speaking of Europe, was always a contradiction between an understanding of European elites that probably wasn't wrong, that Europe had to somehow be more united, that there could never again be something like World War I or World War II. That's granted. But the United States only allowed it to begin to exist after all of the transatlantic banking networks were institutionalized and really locked in. So, as you say, what's going to be really revolutionary and what's going to be the next phase? The organization of the EU, centralized, decentralized, Brussels or Berlin, is it overt or covert? Do we continue with this parade and charade of democracy or not? That is a different question from how do we deal with these technological changes? And now we are putting forward the real final absolute question of who owns the banks and why do they operate this way? How can a functioning society have banks? In what ways are banks adding to the productive industrial side of the economy? It doesn't make any sense except from the point of view of absolute greed, evil, and hedonism. And it's absolutely unacceptable for any European civilization or any African civilization or any civilization in the world to tolerate this level of hubris, greed, and nepotism and evil at this level. So I think that's where we're at right now.
It's really interesting you say that, because there's been an interesting conversation about usury being brought to the table here in America right now with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for anyone recently elected representative who champions the neoliberal Marxist progressive movement here, no matter what you want to call it, the other side of the false dichotomy. She has been going on this little tear lately. And what's interesting about it to me is not that I think she actually understands the implications of usury,
Right.
but no, she doesn't at all. That's my point. Is she is sponsoring this bill, co-sponsoring it rather, with Bernie Sanders. And what's always so surprising to me is how they get so close within the boundaries of a coherent argument that it's like they're so close to the issue. If it was a snake, it would bite them. She wants to cap interest rates at 15% for credit cards, which in capitalist America will only ever bar you from, it'll bar higher risk owners and lower income people from utilizing credit at all. When in reality, she would have gotten closer to the mark if she had said, let's abolish usury on dollar items above a certain amount. I mean, and there's many ways she could have gotten to it, but it's interesting that you're seeing this full circle with the people who are living in this post-ideological world you're talking about. And we're trying to unify the talking points we can in whatever third position or fourth position you want to take economically.
I think that that's a very interesting insight, and I had a very similar reaction. I was like, 15% still sounds like 3 times too high, 3 times too high for even bad. I mean,
well, the Bible says it's all wrong, and that was her gist, and so I wondered why she didn't jump on the platform of all usury is wrong and inherently evil. Yeah. And it's something you're hearing people start to cycle through the mainstream. Tucker Carlson, #1 conservative anchor in America, he's getting on board with it. And so, like you said, the question is, how long till everybody embodies this worldview?
I think that, again, we talked about the stages of acceptance and the popularity of an idea. And our job is, of course, to make sure that the correct line becomes the line that is absorbed. We have to stay on the vanguard and not follow the left or the right, but continue as we've been doing and synthesizing and syncretizing, creating a new paradigm and moving the goalposts. So we have to maintain on the radical end. To keep a fresh perspective, to understand that we are in the society, but not of this society, and understand the whole paradigm that's shifting. Only then are we able to maintain. So in other words, the fact that people, as you said, are now talking about usury. People are talking about socialism. They might get it wrong. They might have a completely wrong definition of it. It could be completely based in a victimological or social justice warrior framework, or a fake liberal, or like a Bernie Sanders kind of whatever. But the point is that banking, usury, labor exploitation, and sort of that relationship between the rights and responsibilities between the people and a sovereign government, right? That delicate and fragile and sacrosanct relationship is being discussed. And if you were to turn back the clock 10 years, or even worse, 20 years, and look at a debate on Fox, I mean, it was for retarded people, or on CNN, it was just promoting the war in Yugoslavia. Now they still, on the liberal, and I mean that the liberal and liberal conservative, so the capital L liberal paradigm, which includes liberals and conservatives. The whole media, though, and they're also investing now, of course, in building YouTube presences and fake independent media. That's the next major big threat that we're already in. They're still trying to contain and control the discourse, though. You see, that's the problem. Not in a paranoid way. I'm not suggesting there's some conspiracy. I mean, it's the only logical thing to do. They are not idiots. Some of them are, but in general, they're well informed and they can make strategies and they implement them. And of course, they're trying to take people and they're trying to follow where the people are at to maintain some viewership, legitimacy, credibility, so that then they are there at that critical moment when it comes to some other issue. So you have someone like Tucker Carlson, and I don't think that he, dropped acid or ate shrooms or had some mind expanding experience. I think that he is like he has been for the last long period of time, says the things that he's supposed to say. And now if real legitimate radicals are being unplugged, deplatformed, erased from YouTube, and you go on YouTube and in your suggestions area is, Tucker Carlson saying like 80% or 70% of what you think is true, well, then that's the audience now. So now they've culture jammed it, they've gone on the stream, and then they've led it and then misdirected it. So I'd be very, very cautious about anyone who's not genuinely independent media, right? So I think that's how I approach the question of media. But you're right. Now, on the question of the organization of the American economy, it's almost too late to be talking about reindustrialization or bringing the jobs home, because we're already now at the precipice of this whole age of robotics and AI, and it's not like you can, the historical record shows that the Luddite concept of being against the machines doesn't work. We're going to, end up in some Terminator situation, in the future. But between now and then, I mean, the Luddite thing just doesn't work. I mean, it's going to have to. You're going to be in a post-apocalyptic, situation where there's been a complete cleavage or breakaway civilization of the AI before there's any human resistance, to be frank. And it's all about now, reintroducing spirit, reintroducing, and I hate to say this ugly, dirty word for so many people, religion, reintroducing the logos, and when we and that is the critical thing that has been missing for centuries and centuries, perhaps 2,000 years, and so, but I am encouraged. I'm not a naysayer and doom and gloom, right? I mean, look at all the changes that have been happening. I've never seen people so well informed at this time than any time before, and now it's a question of, do people overcome these fears and move into the field of activism, or are they still dreaming of the past and dreaming of the future? I think that's the question.
Yeah, and going forward with what you're saying, the connecting the future to the connecting our present to the past and to the future, there is this interesting concept developed by Gian Fai called archaeofuturism. And for example, here down,
Yes, of course.
yeah, here down in Peru, with my movement that we already explained, that our fourth political theory, fourth position, whatever you want to call it, is advocating
Yes.
for a Peruvian archaeofuturism, which is ties together our two main branches of, or two main cores of our civilization, which would be the Spanish civilization as well as the Inca civilization. These two essences are what we need in order to rehash some things within our present and late and close past, like from the last maybe 20, 30, 40 years, to see with new eyes the things that happen, that develop, the events over there, so we can start building a different future, a future that continuously ties up together the most archaic roots of who we truly are with what you're saying with these new technologies. We are thinking of going into different types of energies instead of being a country that is just exploited by its resources, making developing new products, new industrialization, but always taking care into consideration things like deep ecology, like thinkers like Pentti Linkola, like Scott Greer, Theodore Kaczynski, all these guys, but not going into their misanthropy as well. So it's just we take them into consideration so we can balance things out here and there when we need to do, and that's something like
That's a very, very good point. Yeah.
something that was
And
unthinkable maybe in the past 10 years or so.
And probably the most, I know you only talked about it for a little bit, but the most pivotal part of all of this is, like you said, a regression back to conventional institutions like the church. These things about any kind of nationalism needs to be the only vessel, the optimal goal, I think, of any nationalist movement is to remove internal reliance on external forces, and whether that's economic or cultural or something getting leveraged by your country's foreign policy, or bureaucrats and other politicians in their ivory towers who do not answer or speak for the domestic populace of that country. And like you guys said, it is very true. We are hinging on the brink of innovating ourselves out of a job. In essence, we've essentially already done it for the part of countries that need to employ people with less than stellar mental aptitudes and job skills. We are already dealing in this post-industrialization where people are, every day there is less jobs, there's not more. So if that conversation isn't starting to gear towards moving away from those crutches of central banking and easy, cheap credit, and trying to address problems like your country not producing enough tax revenue or producing enough GDP, trying to mitigate those things through things like mass immigration to non-domestic invaders. These are the conversations. They are essential. They are no longer a luxury to discuss.
Yes. It's how I look at, to sort of piggyback on what you're saying, the whole framework, the one of the problems in human organization is that there's a certain law of bureaucratic inertia, and so people wind up, and this is true in the power. We're talking about the structure of power elites in the let's say the ruling class, and why they seem oriented on such a collision course. They overinvest in certain ideas and they create foundations. Well, we can take any example. Let's take the National Organization of Women, let's say, just on a very micro scale, right? And now they actually achieved all of their founding goals, let's say, by the early 1990s. So from the time they were founded, and then by the early 1990s, they had achieved all of their foundational goals. But they still had a mailing list. They still had successful fundraising. They still had a bureaucracy. They still had an audience. So what you do is you have to keep creating more problems to solve in that same line that your bureaucratic inertia is already moving on. And so now take that analogy and then now move it up to the whole military industrial complex, or the whole energy-based economy in crude oil and natural gas. So they have an inertia, they have institutions, and they have these commitments that are based, intergenerationally based, and they have these relationships are tied a certain way. It's not this Marxist egalitarian idea that there needs to be a revolution because hierarchies themselves, or as the anarchists would say, hierarchies themselves are all necessarily just based in a social construction and only exist in our minds, and that we reinforce them because we're bad people, essentially. This is ludicrous and easily debunkable. But that's not an excuse to be against a revolution when you know that these entrenched bureaucracies and these entrenched this bureaucratic inertia at all levels, at the level of the economy, the military, etc., are all moving on this. It's no longer. It has a consciousness of its own, and all the people that are in it are just cogs in a machine that has its own sort of sentience and its own desire to keep living. It's like a beast, an animal that has been brought to life and now will use all of its strengths and defensive capabilities to remain alive. And even though it's evolutionarily outmoded, it's going to drag us all down with it to try to stay alive. And so the kind of revolutionary change we need, it doesn't need to exclude elites. It doesn't need to blame any people group. We are all human beings involved in this existential dead end together. And we all live on a single planet in many ways. And even though there are elites who are wrong, they are also human beings that have adapted to an ideology. And it is very difficult to say, look, we're going to remove your social status, or you're not going to be considered important people anymore. That's something else. But to tell them, or for them to get to them to understand that your present way of managing society is completely the wrong one, that's going to lead to their demise as well, or will make it be so, that is a different question. So I think that there's a larger conversation that's possible that the radical left has not been able to have because they're stuck in the concept of the class struggle, instead of recognizing the reality of the class struggle, but also understanding that ideology is also an ideology of the ruling class, that it's not simply the mechanical modes and means of production that give rise to the ideology, but rather that ideology itself can be changed, and that ideology can lag behind the new developments that have arisen within the productive forces. So now we're talking about 3D printing, AI, robotics, automation. Those jobs are never coming back. But that also means that you don't need money to buy things, okay? But if you don't have people who are going to school from the age of 6 years old when the bell goes off and they're regimented in these standardized lives, or that they're dependent on credit and debt and work to keep people from having too much idle time in which they might do creatively destructive things. That is the real crisis that the ruling class is facing, and they're actually going to ruin the whole thing. And they're gonna create and force just failed states all over the world until finally those failed states come to their own front yards. And I don't think that they fully realize that, or at least those who do have only slowly begun to present these things. And I would suggest that. And we have evidence that the ruling class understands this, because within the Democratic Party, which I think is very strongly representative of the deep state in the United States, as well as the neocons, but let's face it, we can look at the history of the proceedings of the legal procedures and who's been the real war hawk party for quite some time, and it's Democrats. And when you look at how that they have planted their own Andrew Yang candidate into the primaries to create this idea, talk about automation, robotics, to talk about a guaranteed income, that this is something that Milton Friedman proposed over a generation ago, and he's a notoriously conservative, pro-capitalist economic theoretician. So this was really the questions that have been on the table, but it's then something happened and we all got stupid. And then now we're getting smart again. So I'm actually I'm motivated. I'm quite optimistic, in fact. I think that we are turning the corner and that we can do this.
Yes, definitely. I completely agree to that because, I have to disagree with not with your point. I'm talking about the Marxist point of view that, for example, if you own a paper, a paper printing, printing of newspaper, you are completely, and even if it's an entrepreneurship, it's something that you did out of a sudden with friends of you, and maybe maybe a family member or something like that. You already by doing so, you have already established yourself as the dominant
Petty
class.
bourgeois.
Yeah, the bourgeois,
Yeah.
the dominant class. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. But they also don't have answers to people that are stuck within this mindset. Cold War, even before Cold War, because a lot of these people are going back to World War II. Say, "Oh, we defeated the fascists," but you weren't alive back then. So what are you talking about,
Right,
man?
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy. Yeah. Yeah. But that's the whole, that's like that. But I think that's the point. Because on the one hand, there are some good Marxists when they're focused on issues of labor or when they're focused on anti-imperialism,
Yeah.
but then you have the sort of the ones that are bent on the social issues that are not ones that Karl Marx had, but sort of developed from the postmodernists, actually, that sort of infiltrated into this and created this so-called specter of like cultural Marxism, let's say. And this is out of the Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research out of Columbia University, which was a transplanted Frankfurt school established during the rise of the Third Reich. Martin Heidegger, I guess, stayed behind and looked for a new beginning and didn't find one. But at the same time, the work of his colleagues and those he influenced, carrying forward, I guess, the work of his mentor Husserl, but people, Marcuse and Adorno and Hannah Arendt, I guess, and others who developed his work in a more Marxist direction. They have so many very good ideas as well, but the problem is that all good ideas are tools. So the question is, who has access to them? Who is using them, and towards what end? And so these sort of neo-Marxist tools have been used as a highly advanced mechanism of social control, ironically or quixotically, or in a sick twist of fate, to maintain a very capitalist world. And so I think that this fourth political theory that the West has arrived at through postmodernism must be challenged by a people's fourth political theory, one that focuses on people as the subject, to build a genuine laocracy, a genuine, society of and by and for the people, all over the world. And the world is very different and has so much diversity, and that diversity needs to be respected, because we haven't even learned who we are or where we come from. And if we keep burning these libraries at Alexandria, in the metaphorical sense, if we keep burning these libraries in the quest for some global homogeneity, that's nihilism. That's the abyss. That's the nothingness from, the never-ending story.
Well,
that's the monster. That's the Leviathan.
That's the Tartar.
This is the interesting thing about the post-Marxist world, is that when so many of their institutions got so well established, like any control imposed on a market, it's going to have unforeseen consequences. Right now, if I could describe it, I'd like to say that what we're witnessing right now, as far as like this social justice manifestation, and people, like you said, more concerned with the social aspect of it as opposed to the economic, is that, I guess the way I would say it is that everything that is post-Marxist is not inherently a Marxist ideal. It's kind of like you said, the darkness that's out in the ether. And right now, what we know for a fact is that all of these ideologies that came out of the Frankfurt School, every plutocrat national policy, is usually inherently a rejection of logos, which is what people are always seeking to quantify in whatever your political theory is. I know as a third positionist, That's one of the interjections as a fourth positionist or whatever comes after rejecting the false dichotomy is another seeking to venture out and find the logos in what your country's policy and service to your people, what you should be about. But that being said, where we're at right now is we have to, like you said, you brought up Andrew Yang and how, from what I'm understanding from what you say, Joaquin, fourth positionist seems to be a little more an embodiment of the acknowledgement of automation. Is that accurate at all?
I would say that the fourth position that, I would say that the archaeofuturist element.
Right. So a little more transhumanist ideal.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
like
but I would say that the logos and the subject are more fundamental in a fourth political theory that we're interested in building. But I think the fourth political theory is an open project. It's open source code project, really. And this is why, because you had the three prior political theories that arose in the 19th and 20th centuries, and they continued to remix and remix. And the fourth political theory is really in some ways a postmodern, a different type of postmodernism, at least as some philosophers have pointed out, who have championed the fourth political theory. They've said, well, there's the postmodernism of the transhumanism and liberal postmodernism and post-liberalism, and then there's a fourth political theory, postmodernism, which understands that you have to transcend and negate the modernist philosophical and ideological paradigm, but there is a mechanical material foundation that gave rise to wrong ideas. But my point, and to clarify, and I'm sorry that I didn't, and I think it's a great question, is this: that while let's say it was impossible to think about robots prior to the invention of the steam engine, right? That this question has been on the horizon since that time. And all of the development of ideologies in the world have been a response to dealing with this essential human crisis of that the difference or the cleavage growing between what's good for humanity and what's good for this thing called society has been growing and growing over time. So if you go back 2,500 years ago, then humanity and society were one and the same thing. And so political science developed this idea of what's good for society. This is very similar to today when they say, well, what's good for the economy, right? And in the distant past, what was good for the economy and what was good for the people was the same thing. But if you have, changed the focus of the subject from being the people, and you're focused on this thing that's increasingly the machine, right? Increasingly alienated from and separated from the human experience, and it's a machine, then you're saying, well, we have to be serving what's good for the machine.
I'd love, I'm sorry, you said something and it just reminds me of something.
Please, yeah.
As a mechanic, I used to work on airplanes. So there's something that happens when an airplane's prop can actually get so overdrawn with wind turbulence to where the prop actually drives at a faster speed than the engine. And it's a problem we call a prop-driven engine. And like what you said, when the separation between the people who are forced to operate within that economy, like we all are, we literally have guns held to our head to deal in a specific currency. And if you exchange in a currency, It doesn't matter where you are in the world. We all know that there is someone with a gun who's going to control what currency and goods and services you exchange. But what happens, like you said, when that separation comes so separated, the people who are operating within this economy, when we stop adjusting and tinkering with the economy to serve the people, the economy starts to inversely re-engineer the people who are forced to work within it. And that's what I tell people all the time. It's not that you're going to starve to death in this country. You will probably, or in most Western countries, you can live a pretty good standard of life. But the fact of the matter is, the empirical evidence shows that your economy, if your state owns the workforce, it's going to keep on. It's going to start penciling people backwards into this hole to where they will squeeze every single dime out of you, every single source of labor. And when they do something like disperse your work population and drive your wages down, that's economic slavery, just at a very slow progression. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very good thing you got into.
Yeah, I to develop that point then. So when we look at basically, nothing is for free, and there's no such thing as a free lunch, and so when so it's actually only work that creates value, right? So the reason that something has a price, it's in some way a reflection of the work that went into it. Now, you can use marketing, conspicuous consumption, labeling, and you can sell a $5 pair of Nikes for $130. But the fact that it has a price presupposes a broader economy in which people are working, right? So, in other words, if you might automate one part of the economy, but people are still working in other productive parts of the economy. So you can still sell that thing that you've made completely with robots at zero cost, except maybe, let's say, just the very base natural resources like the rubber and the plastic, let's say, you bought from someone else. And even then, if that's got automated, you could take it further and further, right? But as long as
China,
right. So as long as other people were working and had income, because their field of the economy still requires human beings to work, then you can make enormous profit margins in those things that have very low human labor investment, and then are in turn sold at a conspicuously high price as a result of emotional-based, marketing and campaigning. And women tend to fall for this more than men, by and large. But when you take when you look at, but then when that one example we gave of, let's say, tennis shoes are made only by robots, once every single field of human life, every single commodity, every single good or service that's being produced in the economy is done by machines, and there's no human input at all, then you're going to have 100% unemployment. But why would things have a cost? You wouldn't have a market. You wouldn't have a market for those things, but you also couldn't justify a price that you're putting on those things because it doesn't represent any human labor that went into it. So that's where you have to think in terms of projecting forward, like the evolution of automation. And that's what the present people running the show, I think, are starting to talk about in a more public way. But again, if you have people that are just hell-bent on holding on to control for the sake of control, then they're just going to squash, they're going to distort, or they're going to arrive at something like human depopulation.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, I don't like being super dystopian, but when you talk about that progression of things, when, let's say, everything, reaches this progressive dystopian nightmare where we are all innovated out of a job, and now Now, let's suppose we didn't institute anything new. We did not institute this world that you, I, and Alejandro are trying to. You have to be pragmatic about the potential outcome for what happens when you have a state-owned populace, and we know what happens when you essentially become a ward of the state in a domineering power structure such as that. Is you have no idea what your people will be subject to, which is what we saw in Mao China and the Bolshevik Russia. Your actual value is subjective to a force that you do not want to be beholden to.
It's what's interesting is that when you look at legal categories of things or words, and have very like weird definitions and meanings, because we should probably define things by what they do and not what they call themselves, right? Like, what am I trying to say here? So to be concrete, look, if you were to abolish governments, you would still have the functions that government does taken up by something else. And whatever you call it, it would still have that power. So like terminological framework that locates or identifies the problem as being like either public property or private property is still kind of like within the cycle of the paradigm of like socialists versus libertarians and so forth, right? And that will never resolve, because libertarians and socialists have a very different definition of the state, and they have a very different understanding of certain parts of the economy. And it's not to rule out either definition. I think that everyone should study very seriously a lot of libertarian economic theory, and also let's say anarchist theory about the state. But it's the structures of it's the physical structure of a workplace. Like if you have like a place where something is made that has a certain number, that the technology is driving this thing. And so like the legal categories of like, oh, is this privately owned or publicly owned, are less significant than to whether people have the authority and rights to make decisions in their lives. So, I mean, if you have a country and it's private companies and they're privately owned, well, now you're not a ward of the state until you go to prison because the private company said, if you don't come to work on Sunday, don't bother coming on Monday. So, there's been this balance between corporations or the private sector. Corporations are almost kind of in between, but let's say the private sector and the public sector, and people, just to like maintain on some modicum of dignity, some modicum of some basic freedom, have had to push on government to regulate companies, and then they've had to push on or agree with private concerns or private combines to limit the power of government. So there's this very delicate give and take that's taken place, I think, over the time. But I know that the state is only the incarnation of the representation of a dynamic of power forces at any given time in any society. So, I mean, it's a word that can be really misunderstood. I mean, look, we could go back 3,000 years, or let's go back 30,000 years, and we're just hunter-gatherers, and we're sitting around the campfire, and you've got, let's say, maybe some young people from the warrior class, but mostly elders, and they're sitting around the campfire making decisions. Well, they're making decisions on behalf of the other 500 people in the tribe. So that's a government. Now, maybe they're also all related to each other, like it's 5 or 6 different families, and they have rules about how distant you are to intermarry, whatever, it's a village. So, but it's a local council, and you're doing an economic enterprise called surviving, hunting, gathering, fishing. That's a state. So you have rules, regulations. Maybe there's a religion that guides the laws or something. But we can get very lost in terminology if we think in terms of like state versus private versus public. That's like a liberal versus Marxist paradigm that we have to transcend to really understand like what is the essence of the human condition. It's our failure to live in the present. It's our failure to identify the logos and to connect directly with the source of creative power in the universe, which we all within us have a piece of. That has been the missing component in the human experience over the last 2,000 plus years. I think there's been moments when we've been close to it, but I think that the crucifixion of Christ was a huge moment and was transformative. But I think that it's been a lot of backwards movement ever since, and the myth of progress is at the same time a self-reifying myth, but it's also one that we have to take control of. I mean, we have to take control and seize control of the means of production. That's the public. I don't know if that we would really call that a state. I agree with you about this, prison state and prison planet, where we're all basically wards of the state. That's a huge problem. We're in absolute agreement. The issue is that if it was a private sector or corporation, it would be the same thing. It's just a different word to describe the same structures and the same abuse and authority and oppression or tyranny over your life. So I think that we really need to transcend the whole discourse and evolve together and move into the 21st century and like leave behind von Hayek and leave behind, Marx and leave behind the third position as well. The liberalism, libertarianism, Marxism, communism, fascism, nationalism, national socialism. These are all ideologies of modernity, you see. We are now about to be in the third decade of the 21st century. And we're still talking about primarily ideas and thinkers and movements from like 100 years ago. I mean, this is fucking retarded. So that's just where I'm at, personally. I mean, I think in terms of constitutions, the American Constitution, as it was originally intended, is a fine document that fit the needs of its time and all that, But I mean, it's we have to adapt to changing conditions and this technological. We are facing an existential threat as human beings, and it's not just the state or the corporation. It's not capitalism or fascism or communism. It is the existential threat of the nothingness. And that is what is going to unite all human beings, is going to be against the nothingness and towards a new beginning where we uncover the logos and discover meaning.
Well, like you said, the way forward is back. Academia does Sorry. Sorry, got cut off by the call for a second. But like you said, higher academia doesn't even teach the Socratic method anymore. Like you said, ideas that were the staple of Western civilization. Literally, let's see, probably less than 100 years ago. I put up a quote the other day to one of my friends. It said, this country, USA, obviously, talking about my own. He said, this country went from teaching Greek and Latin to fifth graders to teaching remedial English in college in less than 100 years. And I mean, we could have a whole other separate conversation, and I could explain probably why that is from 100 different angles and what contributes to the overall average lowering of the average IQ of a country. I guess you guys could only imagine what causes that. But yeah, there is, it's imperative. It's a very, very large thing to have hanging over our heads. And honestly, I wanted to talk a little bit about Andrew Yang a while back when you were talking about him. And I just, as much as people are jazzed and excited about a Democrat bringing an actual palatable platform concern to the mainstream, I just don't know if his I only see his economic ignorance as exacerbating the situation. He isn't really talking about restoring infrastructure in America. He isn't talking about trying to. Pretty much the most innovative, creative thing this Asian super genius, because that's what he's being touted out about. It's no accident that this guy is a Chinese American. They're trying to sell us on the idea that, hey, this new Asian import model is, this is your status quo now, Goy, here in America. That, like, look at him, he's going to give you $1,000. He's talking about saving Jethro, the poor over the road trucker whose job. That's the most innovative thing this quote unquote genius has come up with, is to say, well, we're going to ban self-automated cars. When I think you'd agree with me, it's way more imperative than just some fucking self-driven Amazon Prime drones or trucks. It goes way beyond that.
It goes way beyond that. Thing is that what Andrew Yang, so how did Andrew Yang get created? Well, he's a product of the DNC. He's an agent of Hillary Clinton, out of the axis, this is the axis I'm going to describe. I'm not just calling it the axis. So this is the axis I'm going to describe. So about 10 or 12 years ago, organized labor, which represents, generally they exist, they existed historically in the United States to stifle and prevent a genuine organized movement from arising. But organized labor in the United States has functioned as an anti-labor institute by and large.
It's a Hegelian dialectic.
So they are creating the problem. So then what they're doing is offering the solution. So, but the reaction that we're supposed to have to this solution that they propose, that it's going to lead to the solution, is that first what they did is they created this axis where, so if you look at Andrew Yang's first major interview that he did with Joe Rogan, you will see that he just briefly mentioned, oh yeah, I was talking to my friend Andy Stern. And my eyes popped out of my head because I used to work for this labor union as an organizer. And Andy Stern was the head of this union. And so he was dog whistling to people that he comes out of this axis where, so he's pretending to be an entrepreneur and he's not an entrepreneur at all. He's never run a successful business in his life. He has a concept of business. I mean, a lot of thinking people have a concept of business where they can talk about, ROI or, return on investment and so forth. But he's not an entrepreneur. He was an Obama administration appointee that received grants. Now, being a grant chaser is not entrepreneurship, right? That's like the opposite. That's like a charter, right? That's like pirates. That's like the British Empire, right? That's not the same thing as entrepreneurship. So, I mean, you have an entrepreneurial spirit, and that might be your like motivating ideology, but economically and factually, like you received a grant from the federal government to do something, and then that thing didn't have to make money back to stay afloat, because then there was another tranche of federal government money to keep your, privately run NGO, but technically government program running. So that's who he is. He's not an entrepreneur at all. So then this is how it works, because Google, AdSense, Facebook, Twitter, they work together. Silicon Valley, Andrew Yang is their boy. But not only that, that's why you saw Andrew Yang on Fox. That's why you saw him on Joe Rogan. That's why you see him all over the place.
Exactly. I tell them, just for a lighter pop culture note, I tell people it's no accident. Like, everybody thinks these very beautifully clean looking cookie cutter politicians and these very, you've heard of the sphere of allowable influence on YouTube. these normie conservatives like Shapiro, like Dave Rubin, Eric Weinstein. It's no coincidence that as soon as Joe Rogan started to break into the hard mainstream and like, oh man, Joe Rogan is the guy, that he's the number one subscribed podcaster in America. He has the most overwhelming base of people who consider themselves to be halfway intelligent males, and traditional males at that. So he actually has this channel into people who may not be conservative, but they're in touch with, Joe Rogan is not a pussy, essentially. So it's easy for people to think that this is a masculine and acceptable pop culture phenom to endorse his opinion. And you see his fans get made fun of all the time. It's kind of funny, but it's no accident that as soon as Shapiro showed up on Rogan, Jordan Peterson shows up on Rogan, all these gatekeepers started making the rounds. He had Tulsi on, and then he had Andrew Yang on, and oh man, Andrew Yang was good on there, man. Andrew Yang is pretty clean. He's going to sell a lot of otherwise intelligent white men on some very, very bad and incoherent, because, there's no, Joe Rogan doesn't do live feeds where people can harass his guest. I mean, they just clip the show, and man, look at this. I'm not a big fan of Andrew Yang, if you can't tell.
Yeah, I mean, neither am I. So, I mean, what the thing is that there's pressure on these media that they have to put Andrew Yang on, and they flex the muscle, and they forced Andrew Yang onto a lot of different platforms, and they told them, you're going to agree with him. This is the DNC's attempt to counter a Trump. Why? Well, because you have Yang Gang, and that's like an answer to the sort of the evolution of the mimetic warfare. You've seen the hijacking of the frog meme. You've seen a lot of this use of the sort of postmodern, post-structuralist, discursive, post-ironic and ironic mimetics that launched Trump are appropriated by Yang. But that doesn't mean that Yang's going to win the nomination, and it doesn't mean that the Democrats are going to end up going with that type of campaign. But Yang has already showed his hand a few times. He's a Russia-gator, conspiracy guy, so you know that he's in league with the deep state.
Yeah,
right?
they put a lot of icing on his cake, so to speak.
They did. But then when you hear him, he was asked, so have you signed the pledge of Democrat candidates that whoever wins the nomination, they're going to campaign, campaign their supporters to put that person in. So first of all, that $1,000 a month ain't never going to happen. So we don't even have to get into whether it's sound economic theory or not, because that is a lure.
At least not on this panel.
It's just, it is a false. It's never going to happen. I mean, when was the last time an elected official kept these kinds of promises, right? I mean, that is nonsense. I mean, that's like, vote for me. It's like, yeah, right, dude. Like, it's kind of like that, the old Peanuts cartoon, and Lucy has the football, and then, Charlie Brown runs up to kick it. I mean, how many times is Lucy going to pull up that football, and there's Yang again, there's another football getting pulled up.
You'd be surprised. I mean, it's like, you'd be surprised how many kids I meet today, 18-year-olds, who don't believe me when I say that Obama fined. I was in the military, so I never got fined. But they don't believe me when I say that Obama sent my friends who didn't have health care a bill for $1,000 every year that they didn't have health care. Like, there's people who look me in the fucking eyes and tell me things that presidents have done in this country like didn't happen. And I'm saying, hey, this shit's going to happen again, only worse. Like, I've watched healthcare and housing prices grow grow faster and more exponentially than any generation in America ever has. And people are still, they will still look me in the eye and say it's not happening. And the dissonance is bewildering.
You know, and it's the thing is like where I'm at with these questions of like healthcare and education, and they've tricked the left into focusing on the budgets, into focusing on access, right? So they talk about public healthcare, public education. Now, in theory, like if I were to talk about an ideal society, right? Ideally, the world's not ideal, but ideally, you would have high quality free public education, and you would have high quality access to healthcare. But that has nothing to do with this society, a society that is not in touch with its logos, a society that is not based in the people. So it's just going to be, you're going to have death panels. You're going to have, the present HMO system and private insurance system works the same. I mean, that's not socialized medicine. That is corporate. That's private corporate healthcare, right?
Exactly.
That's Nixon's HMO system. You know, I mean, I think Ron Paul had a very good point about how the HMO system led to the inflation of, what's called managed care. And the rise of Kaiser Permanente, which was signed into creation by the Republican president, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Well, before you get to that, I wanted to say, there's also that same crowd of people who have that dissonance and say these things don't happen. How many people in Europe have been starved or dehydrated by the government because of the national healthcare systems out there? That you've seen that there was that kid in Britain. I was being rhetorical, but like there are people.
Yeah, I mean there was a case where in England where the NHS, I guess,
they wouldn't allow that kid Alfie to be deported to
with the Catholic Church, got into a conflict. Yes, to the Vatican hospital.
Yeah, the Vatican stuck their neck out for this kid who, they didn't have the specialist on staff in Britain. And the British government would not release this kid to get secondary diagnoses. And it's happened to at least a dozen people. Like if people will lose these court cases, they'll say, hey, keep the ventilator on, keep this, them on dialysis or this, that, and the other thing until we can, and people who are still alive, albeit with, assistance, they're not even allowed to leave because that would prove the ineffectiveness of their healthcare systems.
Yeah, you mean Alfie Evans. Alfie Evans, no? That was his name.
You say what?
Alfie Evans.
Alfie Evans.
Alfie Evans
was the big one.
That was such a moving case. I mean, I remember, I remember someone being so wrong about this that I couldn't talk to them for like a year after that. It was just so traumatizing, and so it was such an obvious case of that the government, the NHS, had no argument at all, because if they're saying he has no chance, then let him go. But they knew that a second opinion would be able to show, look, let's even assume that he had irreversible brain damage or, water forming and that the brain had shrunk. Let's assume that, that was a result of their malfeasance at NHS, that they made the mistake at the premise. They misdiagnosed, they messed up. And that's what any other doctor would say. And that would set up a multi-million-pound lawsuit that would place the parents able, it wouldn't get Alfie back, but it would place the NHS having to pay a multi-pound suit. And it really was not about that the NHS doesn't have millions of pounds to waste, because they waste millions of pounds every year. The point was that it would have led to that hospital director, who knew the right people and was well connected, from being demoted and being held responsible at the level of that hospital, at that branch of the NHS. So, but see, this is all But keep in mind, my friend, that this is all how the public health care is run in a society that's, number one, overall run by a bankopoly system where human life has no value, even from the point of view of having workers alive. So in communist states, the healthcare system was actually better than what we have in the West now, because the communist states didn't have third world empires where they were extracting cheap labor, and they didn't have population replacement paradigms where, so in other words, even though people in one sense didn't have certain freedoms that you might think that people should have, and we would probably agree on a lot of these, right, that the government saw each person as like an investment, so they had to put them to high quality schools. That's why the communist bloc had like the best operas, the best culture, the best ballets, the best medical systems. That's why every person, they invested very heavily in each individual. So we kind of arrive at this sort of ironic or contradictory outcome, where the society that placed the least emphasis on the role of the individual in a society, actually the individuals had the most high quality medical care. Whereas in the West, where the individual is the focus, the individual is the subject of liberal societies instead of the class, which is the subject of Marxist society, legitimately Marxist societies, not cultural Marxist, neo-Marxist in the West. That focus, in a strange and ironic way, led to individuals having a higher standard and quality of life. So everywhere you go in the former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet bloc, the former Warsaw countries, everyone over 40 or 50 years old, because that's who remembers it, will tell you it was better. We had 3-month vacations. In 1 month of work, we could afford to buy a new TV with the extra income every month. The kids always had new shoes, new clothes. The schools were high quality. Everyone was becoming engineers and poet laureates and stuff. I'm not saying it was a paradise. Okay, people live very humbly in smaller apartments in many ways, but they had a society. And what's so strange about this is that even though technically they were atheist societies, they were not consumerist. So there's another paradox, because in the West, you have freedom of religion, but the religion of Mammon is a far more powerful religion than the religion of the state. And so this cult of Mammon worship in the West, consumerism and the bankopoly, that doesn't, you can say, oh, freedom of religion, fine, because we're going to buy you out. And in the communist bloc, people actually remained more religious at home, privately and secretly. And that's very sad. But they ended up preserving their cultures. So in the West, that's why you have in the former communist countries actually has a higher level of more indigenous culture of pre-modern society. That's why the focus of freedom has shifted over to the East, you see.
Yeah, and speaking of the East, I wanted to ask you, since you are based in the East at the moment, how do you see the changes affecting the West, also overlapping a little bit on the East? Because, for example, I had the opportunity to go to different Eastern European countries like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus as well. And you do see that there is already a migration situation already going on. Of course, it's not like astroturfed like in the West, but it exists. I have seen people from that are very specifically African origin are roaming around over there. It's like it was so out of touch, uh, out of
Yeah,
context.
keep in mind that you have to always you have to see if you see individuals or small groups, or if it's a community that lives there. Because keep in mind that the Eastern Bloc, or the Second World Bloc, or the Communist Bloc had constant interaction with Africa and with Latin America. And they were constantly bringing in people to be like football coach trainers, or teach them medicine or language. And then, so you have like small groups of Africans that are involved in still existing programs with Russia and Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, that interacts with African countries. But you won't find them like in more than like, say, the hundreds. and they stick out. Like they really, really stand out, and they're like
Yeah.
really African. It's not like African Americans. They're like really black guys. But and they really stand out a lot because everyone else is like very, very Slavic or very white, I guess you would say.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
but it's not a replacement paradigm at all. And we had when the fake refugee crisis began to hit. When was it? Like in 2015. We had like at one time 50,000 so-called Syrians, and I say so-called, but we had 50,000 so-called Syrians come through Serbia, and then because Hungary and Croatia didn't resolve to let them into the EU because of the Schengen requirements, that if they failed their application status in Germany, which was the real location, because Germany just hands out all the welfare to the migrants, to the refugees. But if Germany turned them away, they would end up back in Croatia or back in Greece or back in Hungary. But Serbia is not part of the EU. It had no obligation. So the thing is that Serbia, by not being part of the EU, we've like avoided a lot of this migration issue. It's been actually pretty nice. But I think you asked me the biggest change that I've seen that's negative, like a Western influence on the East, has been smartphones. So like when I arrived, there weren't any smartphones. Like people had cell phones, like the little Samsungs or the little Nokias, but that was before the smartphones. Okay, so I've been here for like 7 years. So 7 years ago, people just didn't have smartphones here. Smartphones, I guess, got big in the U.S. like around 2005, 2007, I think, with the BlackBerry. But it didn't hit Serbia till like 2014, 2015, and when it hit, it really, really changed a lot. I mean, it's still a way better country to be. I'm not advertising it. Don't come here. I want to keep Serbia the way it is. But it really, really changed certain things a lot, because where kids used to, make eye contact and talk to each other on the street, now they're like heads are in, you see them, like this all the time. And it's a real thing. And I think that has a big effect. And then they're going to be on Twitter and Instagram. So that's going to promote prostitution by Instagram. It used to be that girls, if they were going to get into prostitution, they were for a while drinking or hanging out at Kafana. And then another girl who works for a pimp would make her think it's a normal thing. It would slowly normalize it. There was a grooming process, making a girl into a prostitute. But on Instagram, the girls don't even know they're becoming prostitutes. A guy's just like, hey, why don't you fly out here? You know what? I'm going to send you an airplane ticket, and here's $2,000 spending money so you buy yourself some outfits before you arrive. And the girl just thinks that she's met a guy who's like a rich boyfriend, and he's like a temporary boyfriend for like 5 days.
Yeah.
And then he pays her out, whatever. You see what I'm saying? So it's completely revolutionized prostitution. It's completely infected the so-called Eastern world. The smartphones have, and Instagram has been a huge part of it for sure. It's been a big problem, but it's not like anywhere. And when I say huge, big problem, I mean considering what a pristine place this was up until then. Okay, don't get me wrong. We're still don't come here, but still we're much better off than we're still much better off than anywhere else I've been in the world, in the West.
Well, I wanted to say I've witnessed that same development myself, and when Instagram started being a thing, I remember Instagram. I think large scale saturation for like smartphones in America. I think large scale, like saturation for that market probably came a little bit later, because I moved down to the States in 2010. So
You're Canadian or?
I'm Alaskan.
Oh, okay. So I see. You see. So
sorry, I should have clarified that a little bit.
Okay, right. Okay.
So I made a pretty large move, but even whenever I came down, it was still pretty common for like, working class minimum wage people to not have cell phones, because you still had to pay like $500 out of them. But anyways, I got my first smartphone about 2011. I was in the military, just joined the military, so I had some money. But I got to see the development of, I remember when Instagram was brand new. I remember when Snapchat was literally just an app to send a picture that had a timer on it. You opened it and the picture went away. And so that,
I'm sorry to bother you, but so you're Alaskan, you said, right?
yeah,
Now, is your accent a standard Alaskan, or are your parents like from the southern, like the Panhandle, or Illinois, or Tennessee?
Yeah, my mother has a little bit of a southern accent, but I live in the southern United States, so.
Okay, have you picked up the drawl, or was it an Alaska drawl?
Well, here's the thing: is if no, it wasn't an Alaska drawl. I pick it up. The more southern the people I'm around are, the more my drawl will come out.
Yeah, that happens to me, even if it's like a conversation.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, though: if I'm in Alaska, I swear to God, dude, Alaska is more akin to the Midwest. So if I'm in Alaska, I'll be like, "Hey, listen up, you fucking pussy!" Like, and like the drawl goes away. But I tell people all the time, America's a huge place.
Yes, it is.
So my accent is going to, like, I have lots of black friends. I have lots of like ghetto friends, and I'm going to sound a little bit different speaking to them because their dialect is going to be more akin to
we're social beings. I understand. We mirror the people around us because we're with them and we're part of them when we're there, of course.
Yeah, and so, like, I don't know. I've had people ask me where my accent's from, and I'll have to be like,
sorry,
well,
you're talking about smartphones and the military, but I just was curious.
Hey, no worries. But yeah. So I started out, and I'll reference my military background a lot because being in the military and living in so many different parts of, I really didn't see too much of the world, but I've seen a lot of my own country. I've been based in, like, not over a dozen states, but I have lived in over a dozen states. And being from Alaska and seeing the difference between living in LA, or not LA, the California, to living on the West Coast, living in the Deep South, living in Texas, being from Alaska, like I've seen a lot of my own country. And so one of the things we did, everybody in the military used online dating. It's just the thing you do. You're like, hey, we're going here for a couple weeks. Like, let's see what's around, get into some trouble. But I've seen the progression of what online dating looked like in its infancy at, like, 2009, and when Facebook was still brand new. And yeah, there was actually some interesting utility to it. We live in a modern world, and sometimes you have good experiences, but I will say that nowadays, I don't have any social media pertaining to dating because, like you said, it has all been overtly saturated with the slow replacement of social and sexual equity for females. There's become this slow trade-off of the direct. The thing is whenever you turn sex into this social equity that you only use as a social currency,
like a commodity.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for. I didn't mean to say social equity 100 times. But when you start to turn social and sexual equity into a commodity, like the dehumanization of all social media does, is it, number one, it starts to burr away at the stigma. It starts to dull that edge that prostitution is a bad thing. Posting up a picture of your ass in a thong when you are under the age of 18 is a bad thing. And so you have this trickle down effect of parentless children, and we all know how it spirals out of control. But
it's been spiraling out of control.
It is. Well, here's the last bit I'll say. Nowadays, what I see from other men who, there's all other pages, and I follow a bunch of pages where we post screenshots of women's profiles from dating sites, and it is the most severe mentally ill form of cognitive dissonance that when I started out, like, I'll give you an example. When I had an online dating profile in 2009, I was telling Alejandro this in pre-chat. In 2009, when, like, you're in a
MySpace, or
yeah, well, like a Plenty of Fish account or a Tinder.
Oh, okay.
here's the thing: is back then, and I know it sounds like it's not that long ago, 10 years, but then when it started, I'll give you an example. It was a super interesting thing to be like, whoa, dude, look at this girl. She's bisexual. And that was like a unique thing. And you would be like, whoa, so do you actually like girls and men? They'd be like, oh, well, I made out with a couple. Now I'd say that like 80 to 90% of dating profiles are women are bisexual. And not quite as severely, but yeah, they're just so many women use dating profiles for blatant prostitution to the point to where I don't understand how there isn't massive law office like stings on them. But
because you're part of it.
yeah, probably. Yeah, probably half of them are, in on it, getting paid, extorting them. I thought about it too. I was like, man,
it's part of the ecology,
yeah,
the ecosystem,
these microcosms,
right? Right.
Influence.
It's I haven't been in the dating scene for 8 years or so, and I'm married.
Thank your lucky fucking stars.
No, I do. It's I know it's a mess. I mean, there's been girls that I was dating, not seriously, and then I find out that they're pros and not charging me, but I'm like, whoa, like, I mean, well, you said that you're seeing other people. I'm like, I'm seeing 3 other girls to figure out who I'm gonna love. I'm not like.
Yeah, I've been there too. Yeah, I've been there too.
So I mean, it wasn't an issue of cheating or anything, but it's just an issue of like that's not gonna fly with me in the So we're just having fun basically, and thank God I've been wearing a condom the whole time. For the love of Christ.
The overall point is that these are all occurrences of the frog being slowly boiled. And I said, even back then, I said in 2011, when everyone was telling me, dude, what's your Instagram? What's your Snapchat? Do you have these? And I was like, no. I was like, I don't want to watch fucking. I was like, there's nothing. I knew back then in my instincts, I was like, there's nothing more inherently like bad. Like, that's one of the worst vices I can think of is relying on this external orbit of complete strangers for validation and attention, and letting that become a big part of your life. I have a family member who is a semi-professional fitness competitor, so he's in the orbit with a lot of people who operate in the fitness world, and he's been extras in some big Hollywood movies.
The world,
yeah. So, and I'll say that these people have the exact same problems that they invite into their lives.
Right.
They waste so much of their own lifehood experience in validation from other people that they'll and it starts to affect their personal lives as well, and further when your kids get to see you doing that, and they see you being performative and trying to I lost the word I was looking for, but the good cummies, whatever you get from people liking your photo, it's it's not a good habit to get into.
Oh yeah, it's like what is it? It's been compared. People get a spike in the same reaction that people have to morphine. What is that called? It's basically like an opioid reaction.
Yeah, you overstimulate your brain, and it's that old site. I can't remember if it would be called
serotonin.
Classical
Serotonin, I believe it was.
Yeah, dopamine. Maybe
dopamine. Yeah, dopamine. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, essentially you're classically conditioning yourself to salivate every single time
Get a
you
notification.
yeah, and so something like that to a girl who has bad relationships with men is going to be monumentally more detrimental than you and I getting a click or a like to that 13-year-old who starts out looking for validation, from a couple Instagram pics. It's really not hard to understand how she becomes a prostitute without even understanding it.
They don't even realize that's a really, really good point
Especially,
that you're making. That's a really good point that you're making about the conditioning of people, at even a younger age. Because if it affects you and me, and we have some inoculation to it, we've been around the block a few times, and you look at kids who have been online since they could, operate their opposable thumbs.
and you also have a state, the only god of the state, of this secularized government, the quote unquote secular morality that does not exist. The only thing that does fill that absence of a moral superior notion is the false god of individual liberty.
Yeah,
That
and at the end of the day, it comes back to what Joaquin was saying. It's the void.
The
It's,
void, yeah, the void.
it's what the only god these anarchists and like these I've been getting into it with the libertarians a lot lately, is when you try to establish any kind of uh, public doctrine, if your only higher virtue you are seeking to ascend to is the unabashed, unbiased, unbridled freedom of individual liberty at the detriment of everything else, then that is not a recipe for a healthy society. That is going to give you 13-year-old prostitutes.
Right, fully agreed. It's interesting because these people, when we look at, by the way, and again, I just want to congratulate you again on that point that you've made. I think you've really elucidated and touched into something that listeners should really think about and meditate on, because if you really look at how the commodity-based, commodity-driven structure of society is, it's actually trying to force a further atomization of individuals from each other, but then make them more dependent on this sort of centralized corporate state, internet, whatever apparatus, the sort of hive mother brain, single power, which is, like, as you said, a replacement of like God, right?
If you don't empower the 12-year-old drag queen to assert their individual liberty, you're a bigot. Didn't you know? They're just using their
that's getting all the headlines these days is a Dexter, or
dude. There's like 8 of them now.
Desmond. Desmond.
He's not.
It's so freaking weird. It's like you would like on any planet that wasn't crazy, like those parents would be in prison for peddling, for human trafficking, like that. It's like, so it's in broad daylight that they're trafficking this boy in prostitution, and it's like it's literally crazy world, like it's literally Hong Kong.
yeah,
So
clown world.
And for every outlier, whatever, I don't even know what to call it, for everything like him that exists, for every child drag star, whatever, there's a dozen of them. There's a lot of them for just in the mainstream, but for every single one you see in the mainstream, there is a parent somewhere, a mentally deranged leftist. These people exist in your country. There are people, or my country rather, there are people who are being state sanctioned to give hormone blockers to children, but
and then they put you signal about it on social media.
Yes, and so, like I said, that void of morality suctions into that nothingness, to where you can't do anything about it because the God is the state of individual liberty.
For me, one of the reasons that this has affected the United States and England the most, pedophilia, the sort of very strange version of the way that the LGBTQ thing gets expressed as well. I think that's actually statistically related to pedophilia. In fact, there's numerous studies that establish that correlation. So it's basically that that being gay does not increase the probability that you're a pedophile, but being a pedophile is twice as likely that you're gay. You see, so it's actually very strange, interesting interrelationship between the two. It's very important how that matrix is understood, because it doesn't mean that gay people are more likely to be pedophiles. That's a really important thing to reaffirm and to point out again, because otherwise it's a factually wrong thing to say with potentially bigoted consequences, right? But as a matter of fact, being a pedophile makes you twice as likely to be gay. And what's so interesting about that is that in other languages, the word for homosexual and pedophile is the same word. It's pederasty. And in ancient societies and in old societies, the concept of pedophilia and homosexual were very much connected. We need to really, there is a sickness in like, having traveled the world and seen different places. I can understand how Anglo-Saxons are a little bit confused about sexuality, repression, modernity, and then, what's the word? Fringe behavior. What's the word in sociology? My God, I'm retarded now. It's late. The norms and the
Outliers.
Not outliers, norms and say what?
The paraphilias.
Well, anyway, the statistical outliers is a fine term, but it's actually deviance. That's the word, deviance. Sorry, it's 11 o'clock here in Belgrade now. Long day before me here. And deviant behavior is in Anglo-Saxon. So look, the problem is that Anglo-Saxons never recovered from the in America especially, and in let's say post Cromwell and post Puritan England, never really recovered from Puritanism. And Puritanism is also not where you want to go. Like, these Amish are not healthy people. I know there's like you have to look at the lives. You have to look at the lives of Amish people and what happens to Amish people, and there is the way that Anglo-Saxons in America have developed their sexuality is very much similar to how they've developed entertainment. I think one of the reasons that the British invasion of rock and roll caught on in America is because it was a way that white people could be cool as white people. But besides that, like, brief window, the sexual and social repression mechanism among, this strong Puritan influence, and then Baptist and evangelist, fire and brimstone type of belief of, Christianity. I'm a Christian, but I'm talking about that, type. That this has had a deforming effect, and it has a strong repressive mechanism. And then, so it's like problem, reaction, solution. So now, if you travel in places, if you're in Latin America, which the most messed up people in Latin America sexually are not the prostitutes or the working class, It's the ones who are going to the major universities, whose parents have a little bit of money, and they're getting Americanized, and they're getting into like American style feminism and American style LGBTQ politics. Those are the ones that are messed up. Like you can like see a prostitute in Argentina or Chile, and actually her head is actually quite on straight. It's actually, she's like far more mentally sane than a university student in Buenos Aires, or for example. So it's actually a belief system that's based in a particular American experience that's being exported around the world. But if you go to Italy or in the Balkans or in Spain, most of France, they don't have the same problem in the same way. There's a international campaign to create the illusion that this is like an international movement, but it has a very different expression. Like, this is what I'm trying to say. This is my point, is that like there's a healthy way for there to be public expressions of sexuality and gender and even sexiness and even nudity. I mean, look at the world of Greco-Roman antiquity. There were like naked statues everywhere in public, and they found that these used to be painted. So they used to be painted in the pigment colors. They've done like whatever X-ray or what is it, blue light studies on these white marble statues, and they used to be painted like in skin color. So you've got like nipples and vag hairs and everything, dude. That was in public. And then, you know, the ancient Minoans and Greeks, women would often be topless, or they would wear togas that were open. So this Anglo-Saxon Protestant Puritan repression of sexuality led to the possibility for it to be commodified, because the secret in modernity, the secret in Western capitalism is not to sell you something that you don't have, but to sell you something that you already have. That is the chosen secret. That is the chosen trick, to sell you what you already have. So they're trying to make you think and make an agreement that you don't have that thing, and then they sell you the very thing that you've had all along. Like, that mojo has always been yours, but now they're trying to say that, well, you have to have this watch or this or that or this other thing for that mojo to be realized. So that's why consumerism, atomization, and commodification took off like the strongest in the West, the very northwesternmost of Europe. I mean, Amsterdam is the prostitution capital and the banking capital of Europe. And you know, New York used to be New Amsterdam, which was so this, you know, the Anglo-Dutch banking establishment, with, you know, their friends who shall remain unspoken of. They have dominated this discourse, and it's not selling you something that you don't have already. And so now let's peel that back one more layer. Let's dig into this idea of being sold something that you already have. It's actually everything you already have, everything that you were born with, everything that you need, you were born with. There is nothing. I mean, look at an animal. There's nothing that an animal needs that they don't have. I mean, they don't even, you know. So, I mean, it's ridiculous, this human trap, this machine, this Leviathan, this behemoth that we've built, you see, where they have made us think that we are incomplete. We've been gaslit and brainwashed and indoctrinated and socialized into this machine to be their slaves, to work to have things that are supposed to be reified, abstracted, material, physical representations of things missing from our heart. So that's why we have to reintroduce the logos and spirit into the world. You know, we have to bring magic and mystery back into our daily lives.
Yeah, I completely agree to that, because, for example, that also has been lost within, for example, societies like Japan, and before the Anglo-liberal American experiment and expansion, Japan was a healthy society. They had the emperor had the divine right. They didn't even question that. But afterwards, it completely, as you're saying, it completely goes to the void, and nobody is asking the question. No, why do we feel that we need to praise, you know, McDonald's or Toyota or one of these other companies, instead of just going back to our own spirituality, our own expression of religiosity, or anything else? Because, for example, and you even go to other societies like Tibet. I was reading about Tao, and Tao is basically their understanding of their own logos. So it's it's not just even now in America. It's just something that has been expanded and exported in this new multi-connected world.
And you're completely correct. And Joaquin hit on something very crucial a little earlier in that these in that it is almost explicitly American product, because in the post World War II world, well, we all know post World War II, the outcomes of that war was a victory for the postmodernist, for the Frankfurt School. Those people emerged victorious. That's why it's another funny thing I like to tell people in America who are these magapedes who are like, all my communism, like, we don't understand how socially communist we already are. But that same degenerate modernity that has, number one, infected its way upwards into institutions of higher learning, like Joaquin was saying, is almost exclusively American, because it could only be refined in America, in a place where you have this fickle little thing that is sometimes good, and it's kind of bit us in the ass. This freedom of speech, this unwavering liberty at the individual level, has been subverted. What was ultimately a good development of the Western world and individuality at the lowest level, could only inevitably leave itself open to this vulnerability by, number one, not keeping your country homogenous with Europeans. But like we said, that was a long progression. The point is that, like E. Michael Jones puts it so perfectly, when you go to an American institution of higher learning, and if you take on the banner for what your country is supposedly standing for and emboldening, and right now, like I said, we have that hollow, vapid morality where individual liberty is the only championing issue of your government. And so, like E. Michael Jones says, when, like, if you're in the military and you are claiming to fight for quote unquote American ideals, all that essentially means is you are fighting to expel and export globo homo. You are fighting for, what's he say, Alejandro? He says you're fighting for the gay disco.
Yeah, you are the bouncer for the gay disco.
Yeah, we are the world's bouncer for the gay disco. And it's not, I mean, we know that it was easier to, I mean, obviously after we nuked Japan and, put 1,000 generals on their soil, of course they were the first ones to get this little modicum of industrialization, and not industrialization, the modernization, and their women got the right to vote, and so their birth rates are fucking going down in the toilets, and all these same places, once you recognize the pattern of it's either going to be central banking, but the most efficient way, as Dr. Jones always says it, the most efficient way to undermine any society, no matter where it is in the world, is to sexualize the youth. You sexualize the youth with smartphones and Instagram and Snapchat, or inserting a talking piece into the church, or leveraging the Catholic Church to start allowing gay priests, and before you know it, man, just this week I was reading about Taiwan, and same thing that happened in America when the domestic populace voted against gay marriage. Taiwan had something like a 68% opposition in their national referendum to allow gay marriage, and the courts, they voted 68%, no, get this shit out of here. And the higher courts, who have been infiltrated by our favorite club, they said no. They said no. It's that your other 32% are now allowed to do this. But yeah, that is the product we export in this country. It's
I'm not familiar with Dr. Jones, but from my sense and my thinking on the subject is not that we over sexualize the youth, it's how they are sexualized. And so what I'm saying is that in the structures of modernity, which in the capitalist or commodity banking oligopoly version is a commodification based society. So it's so you have to look at why the pedophilia and sexual deviance is so rampant in the same cultures that were previously puritanical, and or in the second and third great awakening, the baptism, evangelism, the fire and brimstone, and it's and why is that the same part of the world where alcoholism, binge drinking, not alcoholism, binge drinking is the main issue. So the binge drinking and is again not because people are exposed to normal amount of alcohol at a young age, but because there is a media culture which is dominating them with it, but a home life that is not explaining what's the normal way to do it. So like if you have a strict parental framework, which is like you're not going to have sex until you're 20 or married, and then you have a commodified urban media thing and you have 5-year-olds twerking, well, that 12-year-old is going to do the sexual version of binge drinking. But if you go to countries like in Latin America or in Spain or in Italy or in the Balkans, like children will have like a glass of wine with dinner not like when they're 3 years old, but like when they're 10 or 12 years old, they can have a little glass of wine when the parents have their friends over, and the children are like more involved in adult activities in a mediated way. And likewise with risque clothing or public nudity, this was the Greco-Roman way. This was the Byzantine way, even Christian Byzantium. So it's the Puritans it's the Puritans in the far northwest of Europe that are just like the Wahhabis and Salafists in the very, very southeast of Europe and the Levant. These are in these polar extremes that actually these are the puritanicals and the extremists. These are the ones who have misunderstood the relationship between God, religion, and sexuality. There is a healthy sexuality that should be public and that children can be exposed to, but not within this world of modernity. It has to have a more sacral and religious component to it, and one that's more deeply cultural and at a higher level of thinking. It has to be connected to the arts and classical music. That's why you see paintings from the Renaissance and so forth, and the subjects are nude. Okay, it was the Puritans who would order these to be covered up. So I would just think about when you've traveled Europe and you've been to cities like Vienna with the classical and neoclassical and Rococo and neo-Roman architecture, why everybody and everything is nude, and why Minoan and Greek civilization women walked around sometimes half topless. And this is not the same thing as this kind of commodification culture and Dexter the drag queen and the twerking 5-year-olds. So we have to understand why we have this difference. And I believe that it is the commodification system of modernity. And it's based in selling you something that you already own. So they've actually taken away sexuality from you. Okay, they've made the performers like your slaves that you serve. So they've made the performance class almost be like a different race caste class from the people, and the people forgot how to dance. So they vicariously live through the Kardashians. They vicariously live through aspirational programming. This is a very, very different framework than just saying, oh, people lost morality and now they're over sexualized. So I guess that's where I would distinguish like how I've been approaching the question for the past couple of years, as a person, from Los Angeles and now living in a more conservative country, that the girls maybe wear less. So, and trying to understand how that is, right? So that's where I'm at. It's been a great show so far, by the way, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. And we are heading towards the 2 hour mark in 5 minutes. So I wanted to ask you a question because you mentioned something really interesting was the morality, the sexual morality, so called by the yeah basically by England and all their future expansion experiments were also more in tune with something like the Wahhabist. But I wanted to ask you something else regarding that. For example, King Charles the First that made the Protestant Reformation. He also had like he basically lived like a sultan because he had like what 5 wives or something like that. He basically had what's haram, no, is that the word, I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Hera. Yeah. Uh-huh.
yeah, haram. Yeah, basically he had that, and also the other religious leaders also had something similar with the nuns and so on, and other women from their congregation, and so forth.
Yes.
So do you see that maybe this was one of the mental attitude that make a link with nowadays with the more Wahhabi extremists, and that's why a lot of these type of Wahhabi Muslims decide to go to England because they do see a connection to that, or is that just too far fetched, so to speak?
I can see the connection that the Protestant Reformation led inexorably led to liberalism, because the question of apostolic succession was resolved at the level of the individual or at the level of the congregation. So you read the Bible and you understand, and you're your own pope. So this is like the atomization or liberalization or individualization of Christianity. Well, then that's just going to lead to a post-Christian paradigm. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just describing it in objective terms.
I can already.
That society has, now that once you have every single person as their own pope, well, then all morality is relativistic. And then you can actually say you don't really have a social mores or any norms. So then once you don't have any norms, you don't have any deviance. So then once you say that, then you have to say that, well, everyone is welcome, everyone can come, and then they can do anything that they want. But the trick and the problem is that when people from the Islamic world are migrating to England, they're coming with a strong sense of community, and they're coming with a strong sense of like-mindedness. So it wouldn't be a problem in England or in Europe to have the number of Muslims that are coming. If you look on paper, the statistic is actually a little bit lower than you would think if you listen only to right-wing talking points, quite frankly. The problem is that there's no culture in Europe that for them to be expected to adhere to. There's no culture in Europe for migrants to assimilate into. So of course, by default, they're going to refer and stay within their subcultural, pre-migratory ethnic enclave, both literally and in ideologically or culturally. So there's no reason to assimilate into nothing. You have to assimilate into something. And that's what Europe has not provided, is something connected to its own logo, something connected to its own existence. And I think that's how I approach that question, yes.
Man, if you, I know you said you weren't familiar with E. Michael Jones, but like just things that thing you said about how the Protestant Reformation inevitably led to liberalism. Yeah, you would definitely love some of his stuff. So we'll make sure to.
I'll write that down.
Yeah, we'll definitely pitch pitch you a couple, YouTube videos, this, that, and the other thing.
Great.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
we actually had that exact same discussion whenever me and Alejandro got the opportunity to interview him. That's almost verbatim what he said, is that Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation we were talking about Martin Luther like he was a good guy, and Michael and Dr. Jones was like, no, he's like, Martin Luther just didn't want to adhere to the rules of the Catholic Church either. So it was
Martin Luther.
It was a less potent version of modernity coming to fruition back then.
It was the modernity of the time, based upon the techno-industrial infrastructural capacity or other elements of modernity. It's not like, this is what I'm trying to say. It's not like, had Martin Luther been more liberal, that smartphones would have been invented 300 years ago. So the thing that we can learn from the Marxists, and the thing that the Marxists have right, is that this is largely being driven by technology, right? It's being driven by technology. But what we can learn from Heidegger and learn from some of the thinkers of what might be called the third position is that this technology in itself Marx talks about alienation, which is very interesting and also a very connected idea, but that the machine itself has a life of its own, that you are now separated from it, and that society is focused on the health and well-being of the machine. So I think that this fundamental separation, the fundamental separation of man and the experience of man from his tools, this is a classic case of Frankenstein's monster, or the case of becoming a victim of your own success, or creating the monster which subdues you. So human beings are built these machines to liberate us from, let's say, hard work, and to liberate us from, let's say, enemies who could invade us. But ultimately, we've created our own slave keeper. We've gone from becoming master of the machines to becoming the slaves to the machines. So that's the path.
So in a way, we can say that, for example, I was listening to Brazilian thrash metal, and there is a band called Jackal, and they have a song called "The Man Is His Own Jackal." So we could certainly say that this is the situation with men, that man usually brings back its own demise, but not consciously. It's just something unconscious, and thus he becomes his own jackal. Could that be?
Yeah, profound. I like it.
Yeah. Anyways, so now we have just finally reached out the 2 hour mark. So I wanted to ask you, do you have something that you want to plug in?
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation. I think that just to plug, I would say people who are following wars and world reporting on wars and conflict, but from an intelligent perspective that gets into like fourth generational warfare and the role of the media intelligence sphere, to check out Fort Roos News. What we're doing with Fort Roos News, it's fort-rus or roos.com, 2 S's, we are basically taking down the fourth wall. So we're reporting on events, but we're also reporting on the way that events get reported. And we're explaining, what meta-narrative that certain war reporting, certain report feeds into. So sometimes if there's like a psychological operation underway, we will explain that this is the purpose of that. So, and we'll report on countries that we like, that will, countries that we're sympathetic to, whether it's Venezuela or Russia, or whatever, Iran. We will say Iran is engaged in a propaganda campaign. We will say Venezuela is engaged in a propaganda campaign, because we want to educate people to understand that in the modernity, and as we enter post-modernity and into the realm of post-humanism, that these are the weapons and tools that will be used against you. And so you must learn them through any example possible. So I would check out Fort Russ News and follow our Twitter, and share up the articles. We're actually under attack from the Atlantic Council on a regular basis. There's been hit pieces about me on Vice magazine, in Washington Post, Prop or Not, in Counterpunch magazine. I've been attacked mostly by the left, the fake left, the operationalized George Soros left. And our organization was implicated in the Mueller investigation. The New Knowledge Foundation, out of Austin, Texas, private security firm composed of NSA and CIA operatives that report directly to the U.S. House Intelligence, Senate Intelligence Committee, has written reports about us, connecting us to the campaign to elect Donald Trump and to subvert American democracy, even though we are Americans. And
we got to get on that level, Alejandro.
Yeah.
We only got our first write-up a couple months ago.
Yeah,
we're getting there.
Yeah, from angry white man, and supposedly I am a Peruvian shaman, national socialist shaman or something like that. Well, it's absurd. It's absurd.
They managed to not
Miguel Serrano, yes.
They managed to address everyone but the only white guy on the white nationalist quote unquote YouTube show.
Yeah, because we have a Cuban and also a Dominican, so it's like
we had a Hoppa too, but we lost him.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, I'm basically Miguel Serrano 2.0. It's so weird.
Right.
It's so weird, man. It's absurd. These people. But anyways,
so congratulations on your success, and take those hit pieces as a trophy and something to be proud of, and keep up the good work. And I'm definitely proud of what you're doing. And I was glad to be on your show, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming, man. And yeah, for our fans, for the audience, next week is going to be a very interesting show. It's going to be transhumanism versus what it's called ecofascism, which actually is deep ecology. And we are going to have Aiden Paladin and Borsoy talking on this one. So you don't want to miss this one, guys. See you around. Thank you once again, Joaquin, for coming, and we will see you next time. Bye.